Hey, y'all, welcome. So glad that you're here for another mercy conversation. And this week, hey, you've heard about Jesus and the Beatitudes, but have you ever heard of Jesus and the woe attitudes? Okay, maybe not the best title, but that's what we're going to be talking about this week.
Come, Holy Spirit, renew the face of the earth. Set your people free. Come, Holy Spirit, renew your image in us. Heal our humanity.
So, this week's gospel lesson has us once again in the Gospel of Luke, and we're doing Luke's version of what is more famously known out of Matthew's gospel as the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, sometimes scholars or other folks will refer to this as the Sermon on the Plain because cool thing happens. Jesus, rather than going up a mountain to speak to everyone, actually has been up on the mountain praying, choosing his disciples, and then coming down the mountain. And it says he stands on a level place with them. And I love that. I love this imagery of Jesus standing with us on a level place, right? It captures so much of the imagery that we find in the prophets about the mountains being brought low and the low places, the valleys being filled in and the paths made straight so that we all have access. And I think that's a little bit of the imagery that's happening here in the Gospel of Luke. Another thing that's happening in the Gospel of Luke in this particular rendition of Jesus' sermon is not only do we have Beatitudes, but we have, okay, I'm going to say it again, woe-attitudes, right? We've got, not only do we have Jesus blessing, but we've also got Jesus pronouncing some woes. And it's interesting that we don't pay attention to the woes. We pay a lot of attention to the blessings and very little to the woes. So I want to shift our emphasis a little bit and talk a bit about that and what that's about. The first thing I want to say is that this isn't about what we call in our community bad religion. Bad religion is beat down religion for us. And what that means is the idea that someone takes the Bible and smacks you over the head with it, beats you down with it, uses God's good word as an instrument of oppression and shame. That is not what I'm trying to say, and that is not what we believe. And again, I'm not finger pointing and saying we practice good religion, other folks practice bad religion. We're all potentially guilty. It's possible for all of us to kind of practice that bad religion. It's so often how we're used to hearing God's liberating word. But instead of hearing it as beating us down, let's hear it as lifting us up, even when it says something hard, because life's hard. And sometimes we're hard, and sometimes our hearts get hard. And so we need to hear a word that can shake us up. We need to hear a word that can soften us. We need to hear a word that honestly can call us to account. And I think that's part of what's happening here in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is pronouncing blessings, but also pronouncing woes. And the second thing I want to say is, in doing that, what Jesus is doing is he's flipping the script. And that's so essential for us. And it's such a theme in the Gospel of Luke. You can tell that Jesus was listening to his mama. Because in the Gospel of Luke, we get the Magnificat. And the Magnificat is Mary singing God's praises, how God has seen her in her lowliness, in her poverty, in her suffering, in her struggle. In other words, Mary is announcing that the God of the Bible, the God that we serve, is a God who sees us and especially sees those who are left out, who sees the poor, who sees the oppressed. And not only does God see us, but God comes to save us. And God saving us isn't just sending us to heaven, but it is bringing God's kingdom from heaven to earth. It is overcoming the systems that create oppression and poverty and replacing it with a community that welcomes us into liberation and wholeness for everyone, for everyone. But in order to get there, God has to move into our history and call us to account. because we're divided. Some are privileged at the expense of others. Some are benefiting at the hurt of others. And so God, who comes into history loving us all, hear that word, loving us all, but wanting all of us to experience the fullness of life, has to challenge us. And so Jesus, listening to his mama, comes in Luke's version of this sermon and is really, really clear about flipping the script. Those that we think ought to be blessed or we think are blessed, Jesus says, no, woe to you. And those that we think are cursed or troubled or not blessed by God are those that Jesus says, no, you're honored. You're held up by God and valued. Jesus says, blessed are the poor, and woe to the rich. Blessed are the hungry, and woe to those who are well fed. Blessed are those who are mourning and grieving, lamenting, and woe to those who are laughing and living it up. Blessed are you who are spoken against, and woe to you who are spoken well of. Jesus is flipping the script. Jesus is challenging us and calling us to account. And that's important for us because Jesus is inviting us into a new kind of life. Our culture has taught us a different woe and a different blessing. And Jesus says, no, if we're going to get this thing right, then we've got to start and lift up those who've been pushed down. And if we've been lifted up, we need to come down. Downward mobility, right? We need to forsake our privilege. We need to forsake wealth. We need to forsake having more than we need when others are starving. We need to find ways to open up housing and shelter so that everyone is included. These aren't pie-in-the-sky ideas. These aren't abstractions about justice. This happens in our everyday life. And we as disciples, that's who Jesus is talking to. We as disciples need to not only embrace our blessing by God because we are beloved. This isn't about shame. It's not about guilt, but it is about accountability. And we also need to embrace the woe. We need to say to ourselves, woe unto us if we're not fighting for justice. Woe unto us if we're not opening the doors of our churches. Woe unto us if we've made Christianity just a Sunday morning service. Woe unto us if we're not actively trying to create a different kind of world through the hospitality of our communities. Woe unto us, because God's will for us is to move towards blessing. So, welcome to the Woe-attitudes. They're good for us.